Have you ever wanted to camp from your bed with two earbuds plugged into your head? It's the summer of 2020 and we've built a pixel pyre, so let's tell ghost stories around a digital fire. It's the least haunted campfire club. It's least haunted campfire club. So pull up a log made of pillows and towels and turn down the lights while we unhook our jowls. Make this full screen or else go in blind. Either way you'll see creatures in the flames or your mind.
New Orleans. Really, there is no place quite like it. New Orleans is, I would say it's safe to say, sitting on land that was stolen from the Native Americans. A city that was once controlled by the French, once controlled by the Spanish, now controlled by the U.S. It burnt down multiple times and was a major port for the slave trade, which means there were many pirates there, which meant there was a lot of prostitution there. There were illegal substances. There were diseases. And a lot of these quote-unquote mother countries would actually send their criminals there. And then at some point, they decided to start sending orphans there with nuns to watch over everything. Post-Civil War Reconstruction was a very dark, very violent time in New Orleans history. So you can imagine how much suffering and haunting and insanity lives in those streets, in that ground, in those buildings. At night, it's sometimes hard to tell what is driven by intoxication and what is really people kind of trembling to the music of the ghosts that live in the French Quarter and the surrounding neighborhoods. New Orleans is surrounded by swamps, which means it's surrounded by alligators, and that also means that the dead cannot actually be buried in the soil because their bones will float up to the surface. So they have bodies that are put into these kind of above ground caskets made of cement, and whenever somebody else from your family dies, you just open up that huge coffin and slide that body in there and shut it back up. New Orleans really is one of my favorite places, and it happens to be one of the most haunted places in the world. Some interactions with ghosts in and around New Orleans are quirky. For one example, when I lived there, I had a ghost in my house who mostly resided in the kitchen. And if we left wine glasses on the counter, we would come back to find those glasses smashed all over the floor. And this was only wine glasses, so any other glasses were fine, but for some reason, wine glasses left on the counter would get mysteriously smashed and shattered all over the kitchen floor. Sometimes I do like to wonder about the backstory of that ghost. I feel the person behind that ghost was a woman, and I feel sometimes like I can connect with sort of that rage of smashing your wine glass after you got some news you didn't like. Sometimes I imagine that this woman finds out that her husband or partner is cheating on her, and her first reaction is to smash her wine glass. And that really makes a mark on the burning of her soul in that moment, and that's how she is represented as a ghost. But really, these are just my ruminations, because we appreciate those ghosts. We appreciate having that cork, those other dimensions, that interesting element to life in New Orleans, and we don't want those ghosts to go away. We actually embrace them as part of our weird reality living down there. But some other ghost stories are not quite as quirky. One example is when a couple checked into a hotel in New Orleans. And like I said, there were many different groups of people who came to New Orleans, and one of those groups were the orphans. And the orphans, of course, lived in orphanages. Those orphanages were overseen by nuns who were not always the kindest. So there are so many stories of haunted hotels in New Orleans because some of these orphanages were turned into hotels. And so one couple, they check into a hotel, and this was back in the days of disposable cameras. And they were tourists, so they had a plan the next day to go out in New Orleans and take some pictures before they left. The wife told the husband, "We have 5 more pictures left on our camera. So tomorrow we'll just take a couple pictures before we go." And they put the camera down on the dresser and went to sleep. The next morning they got ready to go out, and the wife picked up the camera and saw that all the pictures had been used up. At first blamed her husband, asked, "Why did you take all these pictures? I told you I was saving them." And that's when he, of course, responded, "I did not take those pictures." So they were a little bit weirded out. They kind of expedited their departure from New Orleans. When they went home and when they got those pictures developed, they actually found pictures of themselves sleeping on the developed film. I mean, I'm getting the willies just talking about this, but they called the hotel and asked the hotel, had someone come in and taken some pictures. Maybe someone had a key to our room, or please explain this, because they couldn't exactly figure it out. And when they really analyzed those photos, they saw that actually it was taken directly above them. So if a human were to have taken those photos, the human would have had to stand on the bed, standing over them to take that picture. And surely they would have woken up if there was the weight of a human on their bed. My last ghost story for this session involves a time when I visited the Lalaurie mansion in the French Quarter. To give a little backstory, Madame Lalaurie was a French socialite back in kind of the early 1800s, and she would throw these huge parties and balls, and she was well known in New Orleans for being very social and very extroverted. Everybody knew Madame Lalaurie. Her mansion actually happens to be one of the most haunted sites in New Orleans. The haunted history of her mansion begins in the 1830s when a fire crew responded to a fire at the mansion. At first, they found an enslaved woman in the kitchen, and this enslaved woman was actually chained to the stove. She was forced to cook all day, and the hygienic conditions of the kitchen were appalling. And they found her. She actually started the fire, this woman, and she started the fire because she said that she was so scared. And when the fire crew asked why she was so scared, she said that Madame Lalaurie told her that she was going to be taken to the attic the following day. This woman knew that anyone who went up to the attic did not return. So this woman decides to start a fire to get some attention. Maybe someone can come to her aid. They start to question, though, if you're so scared of the attic, what's in the attic? And this caused further investigation to go up into the attic. What they found was It was hard to describe. There were about a dozen enslaved people, and some of whom were dead, and some of whom were chained to the wall, some of whom, or most of whom, had received what looked like years of experimental surgeries and torturing and more things that I think are probably not even appropriate to talk about on this platform. But it was unspeakable what they found in that attic. And when this news broke out of what Madame Lalaurie was doing, an angry mob swarmed the house. Madame Lalaurie, in all of this, she fled back to France and kind of escaped her fate. The mob decided to burn down her house, and the house has since been rebuilt. And I think assuming that the house has been rebuilt, the ghosts must not be present anymore, was actually incorrect, because this is still one of the most haunted sites in New Orleans. The rebuilt structure has been purchased by many different people, one of whom was Nicolas Cage. And others consist of furniture salespeople, bars, many different types of establishments tried to take over this building, but it's almost always resold because of some creepy haunting that takes place. Really, there's so much more to say about the Lalaurie Mansion and all the spookiness around it. When I was there, I brought my friend to check it out, one of the most haunted places in New Orleans. Let's come see it. Before we left, she actually took a picture of the mansion. When she was looking through her photos after that, was totally freaked out. And I took a look and saw that in this picture of the Lalaurie Mansion, I cannot explain in words what these things are that are on the screen, but something along the lines of a floating orb of grayish, whitish puff. And there are many of them all over the screen. And these are things that are not a glitch in the camera. It's part of the picture. And I've never seen anything like it. There are no other orbs in any of her other pictures, except for this one of the Lalaurie Mansion. And I'm absolutely convinced that those orbs are ghosts that are manifesting within the picture.
Of the first, be the last of the last. You hide your face as my gun goes past. Ashes and roses and pockets full of pain. You cheat my girls like they're just a game. You say that I'm a king, but I wear no crown, and I'll be there. Come back, black stay. Come back, black stay. Come back. Don't wanna wear this cloak of death. Well, you say that I'm proud, but it'd be not so. Mighty terrible job, this I know. But from each child much pleasure could flow, and in the end all your best shall go. So respite your weary bones and rest your soul. I'll be waiting at the end of this winding road. Come, bread, black steak. Come back, black steak. Come back. Don't wanna wear this cloak of death. Once a prince boastful and brash, trying to hunt the wild stag, but instead bargain the devil's deal. Spark the wicked curse with his zeal. Can't you see? Oh, can't you see? Endless death and misery. Call me cruel, but it's not true. Pity me, highly angry. I'm the first of the first and the last of the
After several hours and just as many tanks of fuel, the young man turned off his weed trimmer. All about him the grass, which until this morning had stood almost to his breast, lay yellowing in the sun. The smell of it baking in the summer heat hung heavy. More than a few acres had already been cleared due to his effort, but there was easily 3 times as much as that which still needed cutting. He had been hired by the property owner, who after many letters that threatened fines of legal action from the fire department, decided that perhaps the fire danger posed by the unkempt land did indeed need to be addressed. It was an old farm, a few miles outside of town. In the early half of the previous century, it was just one of many that dotted the landscape, small kingdoms unto themselves, founded mostly by the Scandinavian immigrants who had come to settle this part of the state. At present, it was just another large tract of acreage being greedily eyed by developers and thirsty would-be winemakers. All around the area, the old farms had been bought up and converted into either tract homes or vineyards. The elderly descendants of those long-gone self-styled lords of the land, who were now being crushed themselves under the combined weight of age and debt, often had no choice but to sell to those who would later crush time in the form of grapes. The current property owner of this particular farm was the last holdout. "My great-grandfather settled this land, fought off grizzly bears and the Indians for it, and it'll be over my cold dead body that some yuppie covers it all in goddamn grapes," he had said as he walked the young man around and pointed out where the work was to be done. He was 98 years old. The young man had begun work early enough that the fog from the nearby coast still haunted the trees on the edge of the field and shrouded everything in a low blanket of cold, damp gray. But as early morning crept closer towards noon, the fog had burned off and surrendered to the heat of the summer, Now at almost 2 o'clock, he finally stopped for a break. He was out in the middle of a large circle that he himself had cleared, a few hundred yards away from the nearest shade tree. Close to the perimeter of the circle he had made, however, there was an old, weather-worn wooden fence post. The man had noted its peculiarity as he worked around it because it was a lone fence post. If it did indeed have compatriots composing the rest of the fence line, they had either rotted away long ago or still remained hidden in the dense grass that waited for the cutting. It was next to this post that he had stashed his gas can, trimmer line, and bottle of water, and it was against this post now that he decided to rest his weary body. Leaning his back against the fence post, he removed his large, heavy-duty blue earmuffs. They were useful for cutting down the loud buzzing of his weed trimmer as it in turn cut down the tall grass. They reduced the noise but didn't eliminate it completely. The effect of their removal was that the relative silence of his surroundings was near deafening in comparison to near 7 hours of the muffled droning hum and vibration of a two-stroke gas engine. He could hear the sound of cicadas, the flexing of their tiny tymbals vibrating to fill the air with the background radiation of their minute universe. He could hear the chirping of robins and other birds as they happily enjoyed the bounty that his Herculean effort against the weeds had offered them, swooping down and devouring the multitude of insect life exposed cruelly and rudely by the annihilation of their grassy world. Then a cool afternoon breeze began to blow, and he heard the sound of the tall grass swaying and rubbing against itself as it waited its own turn for destruction. He listened to all the sounds of the world around him, closing his eyes and savoring the respite from his labor. And it was in this silence amongst the swaying grass that he heard the voice.
"I'll push
It said.
if you pull."
The young man opened his eyes abruptly, expecting to see someone standing before him. He was surprised when only the empty clearing awaited him. It must have been my imagination, he thought to himself, a trick of the wind in the grass.
"I'll push if you pull,"
the voice said again. He leapt up as if his backside had been bitten and frantically gazed around, searching for the source of the voice.
"Down here."
The voice, which he could now discern was that of a woman, said. His eyes fell to the fence post which he had until moments before been resting against. What the actual he said to himself, but also to the fence post. The female voice of the fence post replied,
"Please, don't be scared. And I mean you no harm. But I really need your help. And it's been so long since I've had anyone to talk to."
The young man looked around again, convinced that someone was either playing a prank on him, or at the very least, that the several hours of mowing in the hot summer sun had fried his brain. Hello? He ventured.
"Hello."
The voice replied from the fence post. He fell to his knees, dumbstruck, and stared in bewilderment at the ancient sun-bleached, rough-hewn rail that jutted from the earth before him.
"Please, just listen to my story before you leave."
He made no answer, and the voice from the post, or under the post, he realized, began its tale.
"In life, my name was Margith, the daughter of a local farmer. Our farm was never one of the more profitable or larger farms, but we made enough to get by. We kept cattle mostly, but also had a small flock of sheep and grew some alfalfa. My mother died in childbirth when my younger sister Hagni was born. Father never remarried, and my sister and I helped him tend our farm as well as any son could have. In the morning I would milk the cows before sending them off to roam the pasture. And in the evening I would call them back with a culling, the traditional cowherd song. And it was on one such occasion, as I wandered near the edge of my father's land calling out for an errant heifer, that I first laid eyes upon Jacob. I, of course, knew Jacob by reputation. Everyone in the county knew his father, who owned the largest farm in the county, a level of success and wealth that would have made him nobility in the old country. His farm was so large that his father had over 50 hands in his employ. On this particular evening, Jacob returned from a day of hunting, and I encountered him on foot as I was singing out to the cattle. I demanded to know who he was and what he was doing trespassing on my father's land. I am Jacob Johansson. Everyone in this county owes my father something, and therefore in his debt. I go where I please. Would it please you to see yourself off of my farm? I asked of him with as much sternness and dissatisfaction that I could muster. He quickly apologized and took on a more gentle demeanor. My apologies, miss, but I'm in a foul mood. I was hunting today when a wasp stung my horse, and it took off in anger. I held on for as long as I could before being thrown from my saddle far from home. So I've been walking for hours with my pride and my backside bruised. If I offended you with my attitude, I apologize. I accepted his apology and granted him pass across the pasture. I bid him farewell and continued my search for the wandering cow as the sun dropped further below the horizon. From then on, I would frequently encounter young Jacob as I went about calling for my cows. Each time he would offer some new excuse for his trespass, searching for a lost sheep. He had lost a stag and it had run in this direction, or something similar. But that was how our romance began. It was not to last, however. One day, as I was about town on errands for my father, I heard that Jacob had been engaged to the daughter of another wealthy nearby farmer. The marriage would unite the two wealthiest families in the county, and it was not a recent engagement. The arrangements had been made in the past for some time. It was also the day that I learned I was with child. I confronted him the next evening when he met me in the field. I wanted to know why he had kept a secret from me and what kind of man he truly was. He told me he held no love for this other woman and that truly it was his father who was forcing him into marriage. I love only you, Margith, he told me. I'm pregnant, I told him. He got very quiet then, and his face grew still. Then we should run away together, he declared to me. Meet me tonight, when the moon is highest at the northeastern corner of my father's fields, he instructed. I'll meet you there and we'll leave this place to start a new life. I was torn. I did not want to leave my father, but he had me to help him with the farm, and the embarrassment of having an unwed daughter with child would be too much for him to bear. So I agreed to run away with Jacob. That night I stole silently out of my father's house with a few meager possessions that I could not bear to part with. I also took away my mother's gold wedding band. It pained me to do so, but I thought that if I were to wed Jacob, that I'd need a ring, or if times were tough, I could sell it. I took no lantern, but the full moon bathed the world in a cool blue light that for those who knew where they were going was as bright as daylight. I crossed the narrow creek that marked the boundary of Jacob's father's farm and broke through the tree line into the swaying grass of the northeast field. Jacob was already waiting for me. I was so quick to rush to him and threw my arms about him. He held me tight and he kissed me before pulling back and turning away. He walked over to where his horse stood waiting and fiddled with the saddlebag. I stole some of Father's money. A lot of money. I'm going to bury it right here. He pointed in the moonlight to where I could see the black hole shadow of a pit. Next to the pit was the shovel he had used and a rough wooden fence post that it was sharpened on one end. We'll mark it with this post, and in a few years, when we've gotten settled, I'll come back and dig it up. But why not just bring it with us now? I asked. They'll be looking for us. We can't go flashing about big money or someone will notice us. We have to be smart. Did you take anything? I touched the small leather pouch hanging around my neck which contained the gold wedding band. Only my mother's wedding ring. We'll have to bury that too, he declared. Oh, please no. They'll be looking for it too, my love. You'll have to leave it here for now. Just put it in the hole over there, he instructed, and turned back to retrieve the money from the saddlebags. I walked over to the edge of the hole and got on my knees to gently place the leather pouch into the darkness. That's when the first blow struck. Something hit me hard in the back of the head, and despite the darkness, everything flashed a bright white. I fell forward into the hole, struggling for breath, and I could feel a hot wetness soaking my hair and running forward down my face. Still trying to breathe, I rolled over onto my back. Through the pain and the blood and the darkness, I could see Jacob silhouetted in the full, cold light of the moon. He held the fence post in his hands like a club. Trying desperately to get back up and understand what was happening, I saw as the shadow of Jacob turned the fence post over and brought the blunt end down on my face. Once, twice, 3 times. 4. Again and again and again. Even though everything had gone dark and the pain had stopped somewhere around the 9th blow, I could still hear the wet crunching. Afterwards, he drove the sharpened end of the post through my chest and covered me over. He was afraid I'd become one of the Draugr, the restless dead. It was a fear left over from the old country, and instilled in us by lovingly cruel fireside stories of our grandparents. You must pin the dead down, lest they come back. And he was right to do so. I don't know when it was that I became aware that I was still here. the weight of the hard earth pushing oppressively on my chest, the splinters of the wood that pierced my heart, the worms that came to feast upon my broken face, the tiny life in my womb as it rotted away. I could feel and was aware of it all. As time went on, those feelings drifted away, only to be replaced by the burning rage. Years came and went. Crops grew and were reaped. Yet no one ever came to this corner of the farm. It was switched over to cattle grazing. It was just me and my rage and the Holsteins. And I would still sing my calling for them each evening as the fog rolled in. That was probably the only joy I was able to take in all that time. But now, you're here.
The voice from beneath the fence post trailed off.
I'll push if you pull.
This time the voice had an air of pleading to it, but it was a singular statement all the same. The silence that descended upon the field was complete this time. No humming insects, no chirping birds, nothing. Even the breeze seemed to hold its breath and wait. Slowly the young man stood up and stared at the post. Years of exposure to the wind, sun, and rain had long since bleached the color out of it, so that it was now a dull gray. Likewise, in the face of the constant onslaught of the elements, the wood grain had started to peel into long, jagged splinters. Somewhere inside, he knew that what was happening wasn't really what was happening. It was all his imagination. Too much sun and a touch of dehydration. It was crazy, but still he stared at the wooden fence post. Perhaps. He took a step towards it and stretched out a hand. The blunt square top was the only part that wasn't gray. It had a dark black stain that could have been wood resin, but the young man knew that wasn't true. He could feel the residual heat from the day's sun radiating from the old wood to the palm of his hand. The gap closed and he touched the wood. If it was at all possible, the silence deepened. He placed his other hand on the post and gripped. On first tug, nothing happened. The post, despite its apparent age and desiccation, was firm and solid, so the young man began to push and pull against it in the way that a child tongues a loose tooth, twisting and straining, and all the while pulling, until with a slow grinding the post began to move upwards. What started out slow soon gained speed and traction as the young man grew aware that he wasn't sure if he was actually pulling or if indeed the post was being pushed upward from below. Just as he was about to stop, the post gave way, and he fell back upon the ground. He quickly scrambled to his knees and glanced cautiously at the dark round hole that marked where the wooden post had just been. It looked just like a hole. The noise had returned to the clearing, and the young man began to feel foolish. He had surely imagined the whole thing, the voice, Margaret, had all been a dream, and he must have dozed off in the hot sun. And to be so foolish as to pull up a random fence post because of a dream, he really needed to find another job. There was a noise, a cracking sound, and then the sound of dry, sun-baked clay tumbling downward. The man looked back at the hole, which had started to grow, and the earth around it began to sink down. He looked at his equipment that was slowly starting to fall into the new ditch, thought about it, and then thought better. He turned around and ran as fast as he possibly could across the farm. He practically dove into his old pickup truck and sped down the gravel driveway back across the rolling hills towards the old highway and back towards town. When the sun had started to sink, the old man wondered where his hire had gone to. The young man hadn't returned from the field at the agreed-upon time, and the 98-year-old decided to walk across the fields to see what was going on. The sun was just dipping behind a low hill when the old man entered the mowed clearing. It was cast all in shadow due to the disappearing sun, and a cold breeze came from the west to signal the impending nightly fog bank. The old man could just make out the shadowy shapes of the young man's equipment on the far side of the clearing, and he walked stiffly towards them. His progress across the circular clearing was slow. It was slowness that could have been due to his age, but it could have been equally due to his long-standing habit of avoiding this corner of the farm on evenings such as this, when the summer heat baked all the land and the moon was almost full. When he was about 8 feet away, he saw that the weed trimmer was resting partly in a hole, with the trimmer head thrust skyward. And when he was even closer, he saw the wooden fence post where it lay in the dying light. An old cracked leather pouch lay forlornly on the ground next to it. When he was just a little bit closer, he heard the voice from behind him.
Hello, Jacob.
It was the least haunted campfire club. The least haunted campfire club. The least haunted campfire club YouTube show.